They told him his joy was a nuisance. That was the last time they would ever underestimate the sound of freedom. The smoke from the grill was a prayer, thick with the scent of hickory and sweet barbecue sauce, a testament to a Saturday afternoon spent in the righteous pursuit of celebration. It rose from the backyard of the only black family in the Oakhaven Estates cul-de-sac, curling into the impossibly blue Texas sky like a cursive signature. On the patio, the sound of Frankie Beverly and Mays spilled from a Bluetooth speaker, a river of funk and soul that carried laughter on its current. Children, their faces sticky with watermelon juice, darted across a lawn so green it looked painted. Elders sat in shaded fold-out chairs, their conversations a low, melodic hum, the history of generations woven into every shared memory. This was not just a barbecue. It was a sacrament. It was Juneteenth. Dr. Marcus Thorne stood at the helm of his father's old smoker, a colossal, battle-scarred barrel of steel he'd lovingly restored. He wore an apron over his linen shirt. His hands, usually dusted with the chalk of a lecture hall, were stained with paprika and purpose. He was a history professor, a man who dealt in the currency of archives and forgotten narratives. Today, he was simply a son, a father, a husband, tending the flame. He watched his daughter, Maya, all of 8 years old, teach his nephew how to do the electric slide, their clumsy, joyful movements a perfect rhythm against the bass line. His wife, Alia, moved through the gathering like a melody herself, her laughter the brightest note in the symphony of their life. For the first time in a long time, the weight of the world felt distant, replaced by the heft of a perfectly smoked brisket. He didn't see the car at first. A pristine white patrol car crawling along the curb with the predatory slowness of a shark in shallow water. It stopped in front of his house. The music didn't feel so loud anymore. The laughter seemed to catch in the air. A uniformed officer stepped out, his movements stiff and deliberate, followed by a woman in a pastel pink pantsuit. Marcus recognized her instantly. Carol Jenkins, president of the Oakhaven Homeowners Association. Her smile was as thin and sharp as a paper cut. She didn't walk to the front door. She led the officer directly to the side gate of his backyard, her heels digging into the pristine lawn. She pointed, not at the speaker, not at the crowd, but at the grill, as if the smoke itself were an act of aggression. Marcus felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wiped his hands on his apron, the scent of spice suddenly feeling like evidence, and walked toward the gate. The joy of the afternoon began to curdle. "Can I help you, Carol?" Marcus asked, his voice even, betraying none of the sudden fire in his chest. The officer, a young man with a face too soft for the rigid set of his jaw, spoke first. "Sir, we've received a noise complaint." Carol stepped forward, her arms crossed. "Multiple complaints, actually, Marcus, and the smoke. It's a disturbance." Her gaze swept over his yard, over his family, lingering for a moment on the red, white, and blue Juneteenth flag hanging from the patio awning. It was a look of profound, patronizing disapproval. A look that said this, all of this, was out of place. "It's 2 in the afternoon, Carol," Marcus said, his voice dropping, a low rumble of thunder under a clear sky. "On a Saturday. The community bylaws are very clear about excessive noise and disturbances, regardless of the time," she recited, her voice a weapon wrapped in the velvet of neighborhood policy. "And frankly, your gathering is becoming a bit of a spectacle." A spectacle. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It landed on the laughter of his children, on the quiet dignity of his mother sipping her sweet tea, on the memory of his own father teaching him how to tend this very grill. Marcus looked from Carol's smug face to the officer's uncertain one. He saw his daughter, Maya, peeking from behind Alia, her dance forgotten, her eyes wide with confusion. In that moment, the entire history of what this day meant, of what it cost to find a space to simply be joyful and black in America, coalesced into a single point of unbearable pressure. This wasn't about the music. It was never about the music. Marcus's world shrank to the space between his fence and Carol Jenkins's perfectly manicured condescension. The bass line from the speaker felt like a distant heartbeat, a life support system for a joy that was quickly flatlining. His mother, a woman who had seen the tail end of Jim Crow with her own eyes, now watched from her chair, her face a mask of weary resignation. She'd seen this play before. Different actors, same script. A spectacle, Marcus repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked past Carol at the pristine houses lining the street. At the Hendersons' house, where last 4th of July, fireworks were being shot from the driveway until well past midnight, the explosions rattling his windows. He remembered the rock music, so loud his walls vibrated. He hadn't complained. It was a holiday. Joy, he believed, was not a zero-sum game. The officer cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Sir, we just need you to turn the music down. Keep it contained." "Contained," Marcus echoed. He looked at the officer's name tag, Miller. "Officer Miller, do you know what day it is?" Miller blinked. "It's Saturday, sir." "It's June 19th, Marcus said, his voice taking on the cadence of his lecture hall, calm, deliberate, heavy with fact. "It's Juneteenth, a federal holiday, commemorating the end of slavery in this country. This isn't just a gathering, it's a celebration of freedom." Carol let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Marcus, don't make this into one of your history lessons. We are a community of rules. Whether it's Christmas or the 4th of July or this, the rules apply to everyone." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it almost took his breath away. The rules had never applied to everyone. They were a net, designed to catch some and let others swim free. Alia walked over, her hand finding his. Her touch was a silent anchor. "Carol," she said, her voice sharp but graceful. "The Hendersons' party last month went until 1 in the morning. No one called the police on them." Carol's smile tightened. "That was a national holiday, Alia. It's different." "And Juneteenth is not," Marcus pressed. "It's not traditional," she said, finally letting the quiet part out loud. There it was. The unvarnished truth. His joy, his history, his freedom, it was not traditional. It was an anomaly in their quiet, orderly, white world. It was the spectacle. The officer, Miller, looked between them, clearly uncomfortable, a pawn in a game whose rules he didn't fully understand. "Ma'am, sir, I just need you to lower the music, that's all. Let's not let this escalate." Escalate. As if Marcus was the one holding the match. He was the fire they wanted to put out. He looked at his son, Jamal, 16 years old, standing by the door, his arms crossed, watching with an anger so fierce and familiar it broke his father's heart. Jamal's generation was supposed to be past this. They were supposed to inherit a world where their joy wasn't a threat. And yet, here he was, watching his father be policed in his own backyard for the crime of celebrating his own history. Marcus took a deep breath, the smell of hickory now tinged with the bitter scent of injustice. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Fine," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned to Jamal. "Son, turn it down." Jamal stared at him, his expression a mix of disbelief and betrayal. "Dad, but..." Turn it down, Marcus repeated, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. He was a historian. He knew that battles were not always won on the field. Sometimes they were won in the archives, in the documentation, in the slow, meticulous gathering of truth. The music volume dipped, leaving a vacuum. The laughter was gone. The conversations had died. All that remained was the low sizzle of the smoker and the quiet, suffocating weight of humiliation. Carol Jenkins smiled, a victor's smile. "Thank you for your cooperation, Marcus," she said, turning to leave as if she had just successfully mediated a peace treaty. Marcus watched her walk away, the officer trailing behind her like an obedient dog. He looked at the faces of his family, their joy stolen, replaced with a somber quiet. He looked at the Juneteenth flag, its bright colors a stark contrast to the mood. And he made a silent promise. She had mistaken his patience for weakness. She thought she had won. She hadn't won. She had just loaded the gun and handed it to him. The party ended not with a bang, but with a slow, mournful fizzle. People ate, but the food tasted different. They talked, but their voices were hushed, their words careful. The celebration had become a wake. His mother's friends, women who had marched and organized and fought for the very right to exist without apology, packed their Tupperware containers with a quiet, heartbreaking efficiency. They hugged Marcus on their way out, their hugs lingering, filled with unspoken words. "Stay strong, son. We've seen this before. We're still here." After everyone had gone, the backyard felt cavernous. Empty chairs stood like tombstones. A half-eaten plate of potato salad sat on a table, flies buzzing around it. The Juneteenth flag fluttered in the evening breeze, a lonely beacon. Aliyah came and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head against his back. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "Don't be," he said, his voice rough. "You have nothing to be sorry for." He was the one who was sorry. Sorry that he'd brought his family to a place that saw their happiness as a threat. He'd bought the house in Oakhaven Estates believing the sales pitch, a diverse, forward-thinking community. He'd mistaken manicured lawns for open minds. Jamal came out, slamming the screen door behind him. He stalked across the patio, his fists clenched. "Why did you let them do that, Dad? You just let them shut us down. In our own house." "It's not that simple, son," Marcus said, turning to face him. "It is that simple." Jamal's voice cracked with the fury of a boy who was just beginning to understand how unfair the world could be. "They disrespected you. They disrespected us. They disrespected Grandma, and you just said, 'Yes, sir, I'll turn it down.' We should have turned it up." "And then what?" Marcus asked, his voice low and intense. "Then what, Jamal? Then Officer Miller feels threatened. He calls for backup. Suddenly my backyard is full of cops. You think that ends with us just getting a ticket? You're 16 years old and black in Texas. Your anger is a weapon they will use against you. It is a luxury you cannot afford." The words hit Jamal like a physical blow. He staggered back, his anger deflating into a raw, painful understanding. He looked at his father, not as the man who'd backed down, but as the man who had protected him. He saw the calculation behind the calm, the strategy behind the submission. "So we just take it?" Jamal asked, his voice now small. Marcus walked over to his son, placing his hands on his shoulders. He looked him dead in the eye. "No," he said, his voice iron. "We don't take it, we document it, we dismantle it. We build a case so strong it collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy. They want to use their rules against us. Fine. I'm a historian. I know how to read the fine print. I know how to find the footnotes they were hoping everyone would forget." The next day, a crisp white envelope appeared in their mailbox. It was from the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal citation: violation of bylaw 7.4, excessive noise and public nuisance, a fine of $500. At the bottom, a sentence was highlighted in yellow: failure to comply will result in further disciplinary action, including but not limited to additional fines and property liens. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a parking ticket. Marcus held the paper in his hand, the edges sharp against his skin. This piece of paper was their weapon, but Marcus had an arsenal of his own. He had memory, he had truth, and he had a brand new, high-resolution video camera. The 4th of July was 2 weeks away. The 4th of July arrived in Oak Haven Estates with a predictable wave of performative patriotism. American flags, much larger and more numerous than Marcus's lone Juneteenth banner, sprouted from every lawn. The air, which 2 weeks ago was allegedly thick with the nuisance of his barbecue smoke, was now choked with the sulfurous haze of firecrackers, set off by teenagers in the middle of the street. Marcus didn't decorate, he observed. From his study window, which overlooked the Hendersons' backyard next door, he set up his camera on a tripod, the lens focused and waiting. He wasn't just a professor anymore. He was a field researcher, and this cul-de-sac was his dig site. By 6 p.m., the Hendersons' party was in full swing. A massive speaker system, far larger than his portable one, blasted classic rock at a volume that made his windows vibrate. Dozens of people spilled across their lawn, their laughter loud and unrestrained. No one called it a spectacle. They called it a party. Marcus pressed record. He documented everything. The time was 6:17 p.m. He used a decibel meter app on his phone. The music was peaking at 95 decibels, well above the threshold of any reasonable noise ordinance. He filmed the cars parked all along the street, blocking hydrants and driveways. At 9:45 p.m., the first of the illegal aerial fireworks was launched from their driveway, screaming into the sky before exploding in a shower of red and white sparks directly over his roof. Maya, startled by the boom, ran into his study, her eyes wide with fear. He comforted her, his jaw tight, and kept the camera rolling. He filmed for 5 hours. He filmed as the party grew louder, wilder. He filmed as drunk guests shouted and stumbled into the street. He filmed as the fireworks continued, a constant barrage of explosions that went on until nearly 1 a.m. Not once did a police car crawl down their street. Not once did Carol Jenkins, whose own house was just 3 doors down, emerge in her pastel pantsuit to ask them to contain their celebration. The next morning, Marcus sat in the quiet of his study, the raw footage uploaded to his computer. He watched it all again, time-stamping every violation. The noise, the public intoxication, the illegal fireworks, the parking violations. It was a mountain of evidence, stark and undeniable, but evidence wasn't enough. A single story could be dismissed as an anomaly, a one-off complaint from a disgruntled neighbor. He needed a chorus. He spent the next week talking to people. He started with the 2 other black families in the wider Oak Haven development. He met them for coffee, his approach quiet and academic. He didn't lead with his own story. He asked about theirs. The Pattersons, a young couple with a toddler, told him about the citation they received for leaving their son's tricycle on the porch overnight. Bylaw 11.2, unapproved exterior storage, Mr. Patterson said, shaking his head. Meanwhile, the Millers next door have had a rusty boat parked on their driveway for 6 months. No one says a word to them. The Elms, an older, retired couple, told him about the warning they got for their garden. Too many non-native plants, the HOA had written. Their vibrant hibiscus and canna lilies were deemed less aesthetically pleasing than the uniform, sterile boxwoods that lined every other yard. They called it incongruous with the neighborhood's established character, Mrs. Elm said, her voice laced with a bitterness she had clearly tried to swallow for years. Incongruous. Unapproved. A spectacle. It was all the same language. The coded vocabulary of exclusion. Marcus recorded their stories with their permission. He took photos. The tricycle, the garden, the boat. He cross-referenced their violations with the HOA bylaws, a dense, 80-page document he had read 3 times, highlighting every vague, subjective clause that could be weaponized through selective enforcement. He was no longer just building a case. He was curating an exhibition. An exhibition on the architecture of modern racism, hidden in plain sight behind HOA regulations and the polite smiles of people like Carol Jenkins. He compiled it all into a single, devastating presentation. Video files, audio recordings of his conversations, scanned citations, photographic evidence, timestamps, bylaw citations, historical precedents on housing covenants. It was a doctoral thesis on the weaponization of the mundane. The final piece of his plan was a letter. He didn't send it to the HOA board. He sent it to every single resident in Oakhaven Estates. It was a simple, 1-page letter inviting them to the next monthly HOA meeting. At the bottom, he wrote, on the agenda, a presentation on Bylaw 7.4 and the selective definition of community standards. All are welcome. Your voice matters. He didn't know how many would come, but he knew Carol Jenkins would be there, and he knew she would be expecting a fight. He wasn't coming for a fight. He was coming for a reckoning. The Oakhaven Community Clubhouse, usually a sterile, soulless room reserved for potlucks and poorly attended board meetings, was packed. Anxious energy hummed under the fluorescent lights. People stood along the back wall, spilling out into the hallway. Marcus saw the faces of the Pattersons and the Elms, who gave him small, nervous nods. He saw his neighbors, the Hendersons, who looked confused, and a dozen other residents whose expressions ranged from curious to hostile. At the front of the room, Carol Jenkins sat at a long table with the other 4 members of the HOA board. She looked flustered, her usual composure fraying at the edges. She gripped a wooden gavel, tapping it impatiently. Beside her sat a man in a crisp suit Marcus didn't recognize, the HOA lawyer. They had come prepared for a battle. They had no idea he was bringing a war. This meeting will now come to order, Carol announced, her voice strained. She ran through the initial agenda items, landscaping bids, pool maintenance, her words rushed, trying to fast forward to the main event. Finally, she sighed. And now, under new business, Mr. Thorne has requested time to speak regarding his recent citation. She looked at Marcus, her expression a mix of irritation and smug confidence. You have 5 minutes, Marcus. Marcus walked to the small lectern at the front of the room. He carried no notes, just a small remote for the projector he had set up. He looked out at the crowd, then at the board. Thank you, Carol, he began, his voice calm and clear, the voice of a man in complete control. But I'm not here to talk about my citation. I'm here to talk about the soul of this neighborhood. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The lawyer whispered something to Carol. 5 minutes, Marcus, she repeated, her voice sharper. "I won't need that long," he said. He clicked the remote. The projector screen behind him lit up. It was a video of the Hendersons' 4th of July party. The deafening rock music filled the room. The camera panned across the crowd, the illegal fireworks exploding in the night sky. He let it play for a full minute in silence, the evidence washing over the room. The Hendersons sank lower in their chairs, their faces flushed. He clicked the remote again. The video stopped, replaced by a side-by-side image. On the left, a photo of his family's quiet Juneteenth gathering taken before the police arrived. On the right, a still from the chaotic 4th of July party. Underneath, he'd superimposed the decibel readings. 75 dB for his, 95 dB for theirs. Bylaw 7.4, Marcus said, turning to the board. Prohibits excessive noise. My celebration was deemed excessive. Theirs was not. I was fined $500. They were not. I would love for the board to explain the standard being applied here. What is the metric for a nuisance in Oak Haven? The lawyer started to stand. Mr. Thorne, the board is not required to debate its enforcement decisions in a public forum. I'm not debating, Marcus said, his eyes locking with the lawyer's. I'm presenting evidence of a pattern. He clicked the remote. A photo of the Pattersons' tricycle appeared next to a photo of the Millers' rusty boat. He clicked again. A photo of the Elms' vibrant, incongruous garden next to a photo of another neighbor's overgrown, weed-choked yard that had never received a warning. Click, click, click. For every violation notice issued to a black family, he presented a mirror image, a more egregious violation by a white family that had been completely ignored. The room was silent. The air was thick with the undeniable truth of his presentation. It was a meticulous, damning indictment. This isn't about noise or tricycles or gardens, Marcus said, his voice rising with a controlled passion. It's about who gets to belong without condition. It's about the quiet, insidious ways that rules are used not to build community, but to police it. This is about whose traditions are considered normal and whose are considered a spectacle. He turned his gaze directly to Carol. You stood in my yard, and you told me my celebration of freedom was a problem. You brought a police officer to my home to intimidate my family. You did it not because we were loud, but because we were different, because our joy didn't fit your definition of community character. Carol's face was pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The fine you issued me is not a fine, Marcus continued, his voice resonating through the room. It's a tax for living while black in Oak Haven. And I am not paying it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then came the final, devastating blow. A man stood up from the back of the room. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a commanding presence. It was Benjamin Clark, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state of Texas, a man Marcus knew from his work at the university. My name is Benjamin Clark, the attorney announced, his voice booming. And I am representing Dr. Thorne, the Patterson family, and the Elm family. Based on the meticulously documented evidence of discriminatory practices and targeted harassment presented here tonight, we will be filing a class action lawsuit against the Oak Haven Homeowners Association and its board members for violations of the Fair Housing Act. We will be seeking punitive damages, a full-scale federal investigation into your enforcement practices, and the immediate resignation of the board president. The room erupted. Carol Jenkins stared, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The HOA lawyer looked like he had been physically struck. The residents were on their feet, some shouting, some filming, some staring in stunned silence. Marcus stood at the lectern, calm amidst the storm he had created. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a threat. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered the entire room. The lawsuit was a firestorm. The story was picked up by local news, then national outlets. The historian vs. the HOA became a headline, a parable for modern suburbia. The Oakhaven Board, faced with irrefutable evidence and mounting legal fees, folded within a month. The settlement was sweeping. They rescinded all the contested fines, issued a formal public apology, and the entire board, including Carol Jenkins, was forced to resign. The HOA was placed under a court-ordered monitoring program to ensure fair and equitable enforcement of its bylaws, which were themselves rewritten with the help of civil rights advocates. Carol Jenkins sold her house and moved away 6 weeks later. She left quietly, without a word. One Saturday afternoon, months later, Marcus was in his backyard. The air was cool, the sky a placid, cloudless blue. The big steel smoker was cold, but the Juneteenth flag still hung from the patio awning, its colors bright and defiant. He held his father's old, worn grilling tongs in his hand, feeling the familiar weight of the metal. The war was over. The quiet was peace, not suppression. Jamal came out and stood beside him. He looked at the flag, then at his father. "Did we win, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft. Marcus looked from his son's face to the flag, then out across the yards of Oakhaven. He saw Mr. Patterson's son riding his tricycle freely on the sidewalk. He saw the elms tending to their brilliant, blooming hibiscus. The sounds he heard were just the sounds of a neighborhood at peace, a lawnmower in the distance, children laughing, a dog barking, the sound of people simply living. He squeezed his son's shoulder, a profound sense of calm settling deep in his bones. "Some victories aren't loud, son," he said. "They're just free."